I want us to look at the judgment of the nations according to Joel chapter 3. Let me read it to you. Joel 3 says this: I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there, and on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them amongst the nations and have divided up my land. That's verse 2 from Joel chapter 3. So faithful members of God's covenant people in the 6th century would doubtless ask this particular question: what about us? What's going to happen to us? They would continually ask that particular question. Their former countrymen in the northern kingdom of Israel had already lost their land, and we read that in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through to 23. And the prophets were predicting that Judah's imminent fall would occur to the Babylon nation. And we find that in the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, verses 5 to 11. And although faithful old covenant members knew that they had no righteousness in themselves, but looked forward to the Messiah for their right standing before God, they also knew that the Lord promised to bless those whose life conformed to his law. Genesis 15 verse 8 tells us that, and even Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 1 through to 4. Yet because they lived in Judah, they're about to feel the horrible, terrible effects of God's judgment upon the nation as a whole, where people were impertinent and covenant breakers, vastly outnumbered those who were covenant, God-loving people. So what would the ultimate end be? How would all it end up? So the prophets give the same answer to this one question, and that faithful members of God's covenant people would experience a full restoration in the day of the Lord. And Joel closes the book with this particular message, looking forward down through time on the day when God would gather all of the nations and bring them all down into the valley of Jehoshaphat and enter into judgment with them there in chapter 3, verse 2 of the book of Joel. The exact location of this valley, it's unknown, and although it has traditionally been associated with the Kidron Valley to the east of Jerusalem. However, Joel may not mean to identify a precise geographic location, for the term Jehoshaphat means Yahweh has judged. And judgment, he says, will occur at the valley where Yahweh has judged. Now, whether or not the valley of Jehoshaphat is a literal, physical location, what Joel foresaw was a final day of judgment for the nations and a vindication of God's faithful, Spirit-led people. The nations had captured many believers. They had sold them into slavery, which was a capital crime for Israel under the Old Covenant, Exodus chapter 21, 16, and Deuteronomy chapter 21, also in verse 14. As if the kidnapping and selling of the people were not enough, these nations had used the proceeds wastefully on prostitutes, on alcohol, on which they would get drunk, in Joel chapter 3, verse 3. And this overcoming evil could not go unpunished. And though God's faithful old covenant people had suffered so much at the hands of these nations, this prophecy that Joel gives brings hope that the Lord would avenge them, and on that particular day God would prove himself to be the stronghold for his people, guarding them from the final wrath and blessing them tremendously. We see in Joel chapter 17 through to Joel chapter 3 verses 17 through to 19. And the Lord would return to Zion, never to leave again, and he would preserve his people forever, verses 20 through to 21. But under the full revelation of the new covenant, the idea of God as our stronghold is seen even better, even clearer than it was seen in the Old Testament. The Lord protects us from his final wrath by clothing us in the perfect righteousness of Christ, which means that he can pass over us in his eternal wrath and provide us with even greater restoration of all in the new heaven and the new earth. And this is only safety from the judgment from God that he provides for us. God is our strong tower and the perfect righteousness of Christ, which is brought to us through the power of the Holy Spirit. Thank God for his righteousness, and thank God for the power of the Spirit of God delivering us his promises.